Okay, good morning, everybody, or good evening, rather. Good morning to Dr. Sohum Sohoni. I'm going to just introduce Dr. Sohum Sohoni here just a minute. And I guess my screen is being shared. I didn't know that.
Right, and you're not my husband, and I'm not your.
I'm not really not apart from being my husband. That would be funny. Yeah. So, yep. I'm probably just going to go to the website and put that up there for while
Yeah.
I'm using you. That makes sense. Good. You can see your face, everything. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these days audio only seems very ancient. You gotta have video.
Yeah, because everybody got used to Zoom. That's the thing. That's I think
Yeah.
and people prefer the just seeing the whole everything. So okay. Okay, everybody, let's get started. And I was just pulling up the screen for the web page on ICTI 2022. This is what has triggered the need to have a talk by Dr. Sohum Sohoni, which is get you ready if you're not already ready, not already publishing a paper for the ICTI 2022. I don't know why my thing is taking so long. Come on, guys, maybe I'm the wrong. I'm in the ICT. I think just very slow today for some reason. Strange. Okay, I'm just going to introduce you and move on. Okay. So I'm going to let you share the screen because that's not coming. Other thing is not coming up. So I'm going to share the screen.
All right.
And then while you are there, I'll put on your first slide. If I get the website, I'll show it later on. Okay. So you can
Yeah,
share.
I can try to
Great.
pull up the website as well if you give me a moment. So let me. Yeah.
Yeah, if you get it there. Okay. So okay, great. Thank you, guys. Everybody, I just don't want to waste too much time. So let's get started. Dr. Sohum Sohoni, thank you for joining us and taking the time to do this presentation for us. Dr. Sohum Sohoni is a professor of computer science at Milwaukee School of Engineering. Some of you were at the summit yesterday, so you might already recognize him from the discussion we had yesterday. So prior to being at Milwaukee School of Engineering, he was in the faculty at Arizona State and Oklahoma State University. Received his PhD in computer engineering from the University of Cincinnati, and his BE in electrical engineering from the Government College of Engineering, Pune. His research is in computer engineering and engineering education. Published over 40 peer-reviewed papers and has received several Best Paper Awards. He has received many teaching awards, including the Regents Distinguished Teaching Award in 2010 at Oklahoma State University. He's a member of ACM and ASEE, which is American Society of Engineering Education, and a senior member of IEEE. He serves as an associate director of Indo-Universal Collaboration on Education, IUCEE, and more importantly, as the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Engineering Education Transformation, JEET, that many of you might be familiar with. This is a Scopus Index journal that IUCEE collaborates with Rajaram Bapu Institute of Technology. Sohum serves on the governing board of the Research and Engineering Education Network. So with that, I will hand this over to Dr. Sohum Sohoni. So you're on.
Hey, thanks, Krishna. I did manage to get the website up. Hopefully you can see it on the screen. So if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I want to encourage all of you to submit papers. Okay, the August 15th is the deadline, so you just have a little more than a month. And as you can see, you go to the website ictiee.org, or you can go through the IUCEE.org onto this website, and then you will see the various categories down there. Okay, you'll see the student-centered learning environment. That's one category, and so on. You can see all the categories in there. This is the typical categories for teaching and learning. You may not be able to read it that because they're not very big on the screen, but go to the website and please get ready and publish your paper in there. The best papers that are reviewed in this for this conference will be published in JEET. Okay, so keep that in mind. Not all of them, but only the best papers will be published in JEET. So And those of you who are not publishing papers, I'm going to ask you to review some of the papers though. So be prepared for that then, okay? Because you got your email ID through this meeting, so I'm going to send you a few papers to review. All right, great, thanks. We got 141 people, so it's a popular
Great.
group here,
Excellent.
popular man. Okay, so go ahead, keep going. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Krishna. So I will start sharing the slide set now. And yep, works perfectly. All right. Yeah. So I normally like to keep things very interactive and informal, but today there is a lot of content. I have 25 slides, which for me is more than what I usually have for a 1-hour talk. So I'll try to go through it quickly and hopefully have some time for Q&A. But do post in the chat for questions and answers, and maybe Krishna or Sridhar can monitor that.
I'll keep a lookout for the chats. Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay. So Krishna has already given an introduction, so I can go through this a little quickly. Just wanted to touch on a few points. One of the main points being that my background is in electrical and computer engineering. My PhD was in computer engineering, not in engineering education. So you don't need a PhD in EER in order to do this kind of work, what I'm going to be talking about. I've got experience as a faculty member, it's already mentioned. Professor of computer science, and actually just prior to this weekend, I got news that I'm going to be appointed as the program director for software engineering at MSOE.
Congratulations. Wow,
yeah,
good.
thanks. Yeah, it's going to happen in November. And yeah, I mentioned these best paper awards again, because I want to be clear that even with a more technical background, all of the papers that I've received awards for have been actually 3 out of the 4 awards that I've received, best paper awards, are in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So it's again, want to just stress that you don't have to have a PhD in this area in order to do good work in engineering education research or the scholarship of teaching and learning. And I'll be explaining briefly what is SOTL, or the scholarship of teaching and learning, in just a minute. So these slides I'm presenting today are the work of a number of people. I just wanted to make sure I acknowledge. So back in 2017, started working with Dr. Scotty Craig to do the first iteration of these slides, part of a 7-week webinar course that we ran, and then worked with Pratibha Nagabhushan of IUCEE from Australia to further refine these things. And then one of the iterations I've taught of the engineering education research course, again, the shorter version, was with Javed Kittur of KLE Technological University, who is now a PhD student at ASU. So just wanted to make sure I acknowledge my co-workers on all of this. So let me start with a couple of interactive things here. I'd like to know your opinion on why do we write research papers? And I'm going to try to pull up the chat on my other screen here. So please feel free to type in your answers. Think about them. Don't just start typing. Think about.
Can you read the chat, or should I read them out for you?
I should be able to see the chat.
You can read them out if you want. To know things. First comment, to know things. To let the world know about the research that you've done.
Very good. That's an excellent point.
Yeah. All right, keep coming. Share expertise. To express your thoughts.
Yeah.
Publish journal. Communicate research findings.
Very good.
Share best practice in engineering education.
Yeah.
Communicate what we're doing. Express ideas. In order to share the learned knowledge with the peers. Add something in the existing knowledge, etc. Okay.
Excellent. Good. So very good answers. Excellent answers. I'm happy to hear all of these. That's typically what I would have said as well. One other thing I would add to that is, in order to progress in your careers, right? I'm sure there is some kind of promotion and tenure, or promotion thing that happens at your respective institutions, and the number of papers that you have published matters over there. So clearly that's an incentive as well. But all the answers that Krishna had are excellent answers. Let's do a quick poll at this point. I have one other interactive.
I will launch the poll.
Yeah, and I will advance the slide so they can see what the question is here.
Okay, you can read out the poll first before I put it up. Let them think about it. Read it out if you want, right?
Yeah, so it's a simple question. How long do you think it takes from the time you think about writing a research paper on a certain topic, right? You're thinking, okay, this is what I want to do, until it actually gets published in a peer-reviewed journal in this case. So we're not talking conference, but specifically a journal. Okay, so think about that, and then those are your options there. Hopefully they show up as
Yeah,
came up.
yeah.
Yeah.
Launched. The poll is launched.
All right, thanks.
2 months or less, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years or more. Okay, half of you already have voted. Wow, in the first 15 seconds. Not bad.
Wow, that's good.
They're pretty alert. 65% voted, and now the remaining people are going to be slow. Come on, guys, the rest of you, the slow guys, keep coming, keep coming. 72%. Okay, I'm going to wait for a few more to come in and then broadcast the results. 76%, a few more. We need more than 80%, and then I'll
Yeah,
do
like
what is
80% is good.
80% is good, right? Okay, so we
Yeah.
will close and share. And what we see is 11% thinks it takes 2 months or less. 28% it says it takes 6 months. And 51% says it's 1 year. 9% says 2 years. 1% says 3 years or more. Wow. Okay.
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 Yeah, I
I'm gonna
like
hide.
to run this poll every time I do this because it's very revealing, right? And
Yeah.
we should actually do this in one of the leadership summits as well to see what is the management's expectation on how long it takes.
Yeah.
So there isn't a right answer per se on this slide, but there are certainly wrong answers. And the first three are definitely wrong answers. So from the time you start thinking about doing some research on some topic, and you do the literature review, you figure out what exactly you should be doing, you set up the experiment, you actually do the work, you gather the data, you write your paper, you submit it for review, it goes through the review process, you get corrections most likely, that you redo some of the stuff and you resubmit, it gets re-reviewed. All of that typically takes 3 years or more. Okay, so I just want to put it in perspective. You've got a month to the deadline for ICTI-EE, and so obviously some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is not going to be useful for this year, but it'll be likely useful for next year. But some of it should be useful. If you've already done the work and you're in the process of just writing, today's talk should be helpful. But I just wanted to put things in perspective because quite often people think it shouldn't take more than a year, and that's 51% thought that it's about 1 year from the time you start doing the work till you publish. It takes a long time. Just the review itself can take a whole year in most journals of high quality. Okay, so just wanted to put that in perspective. So let's continue. So one of the things we talk about in this talk is essentially where to submit. So journals and conferences are typically the two outlets that you have. And the advantage of going with journals is typically they're free. If you have a journal that's asking for a lot of money to publish your paper, that's usually not a good journal. So beware. That's a generalization, but holds true for the most part. Journals tend to be more prestigious than conferences, and they also allow longer papers. Most conferences have some deadline, some limit on how many pages the paper can be. Is usually 6 pages or 10 pages or something like that, usually not more than that. Conferences, journals, I've submitted papers that have been over 50 pages. Not that we were aiming for a long paper, but sometimes the work you're doing requires a lot of explanation, almost turns into a mini book or something like that. And most journals will allow that. There might be some additional charges for additional pages, but that's an advantage of journals. Conferences, on the other hand, have some advantages and disadvantages as well. So conferences can be expensive. So just as an example, the American Society for Engineering Education annual conference registration is ridiculous. It's like $700 or even more now. The advantages they can be interactive. You can get immediate feedback, and that's partly with ICTI-EE. You should be able to publish work that is ongoing. Perhaps it's not completely done, but you want to get some quick feedback. Are you in the right direction? Are you doing the right kind of work? And it's great. A conference is a great outlet for something like that. It's also very good for networking and forming new collaborations. So it's not a question of, again, just shaking hands and saying hello at a conference, but actually engaging in a deeper conversation about the work that you're doing, and then finding perhaps collaborators. I've actually run into people at conferences and just talked about something and ended up spending 2 or 3 or 4 years working with them on projects. So it can and should happen. That's part of the reason for having a conference. Okay, so as you're thinking to ICT, IEE, even in a virtual environment, you can try to get the most out of it by engaging deeply. Okay, all right, so let's talk about what is SOTL, or the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So usually the progression for SOTL comes from scholarly teaching. So many of you may have gone through the certification program that IUCEE runs, and that's a very good step towards scholarly teaching, where you are actually trained and told about innovative pedagogical techniques, about innovations in designing your course, in designing assessment and things like that. So you're learning from the work of others. So that's scholarly teaching, whether you're reading about how to teach, or for that matter, even reading about what's the latest that's going on in your subject matter in order to figure out what to teach and so on. Okay, so SOTL is the next sort of progression from there, where, okay, you've got some great ideas, you're trying them out in your classroom, and then you want to apply, as you're applying these methods, you want to measure the impact of doing that, right? So you try to set up some kind of experiment. Hopefully it's a little better than just saying, did the students like it or not? So a poll like that is somewhat useless as far as adding to the research is concerned. But hopefully you're thinking about setting up some comparison of, when I didn't do this, this is typically what the average marks were for the students, and now that I'm doing this innovative technique in my classroom, students are scoring on an average 10-15% higher. That's a significant finding, and something that can be put into your work, right? So measuring the impact of the teaching innovation, and then contextualizing that work in what is known. This is, I would say, the most important part of writing a research paper, whether it's in engineering education research or your technical research, or whether it's in the scholarship of teaching and learning, right? Remember, so you're doing this innovation because you read something about it or someone told you something about it, right? So there exists material on this particular topic, and now you've done something that hopefully, as you've said in the question that I asked earlier, adding to the literature, right? Adding to the body of knowledge on this particular topic. So it's very important that once you've done your work, you want to say why this work is important, right? Why should someone read this? You should always think about writing a paper of this kind or an article which will be useful for someone else, right? You're writing a paper not for yourself. Most people make this mistake. They write a paper based on, okay, this is what I want to tell, right? Instead of that, you should get into this mindset, and I'll say this again throughout the hour today, get into the mindset of, why am I writing this paper, and who's going to read it, and what would they be interested in reading or learning, right? As long as you think of each section of your paper from that perspective, you're likely going to write a good paper. All right, so let's get into the parts of a paper. And Krishna, if there's questions that come on the chat, if you could interrupt me.
I'll interrupt. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So what's a typical paper made of, right? It's got an abstract usually that's sort of outside of the paper in some ways, because you can see the abstract without seeing the paper. But then the actual paper has typically an introduction, method section, results section, and a discussion. Okay, and this is particularly for engineering education research or SOTL kind of papers. And there could be some variations. The introduction in this case includes the literature review section. There could be a separate literature review. Similarly, there could be a separate conclusion section at the end, but it could also be part of the discussion section. Okay, so broadly speaking, these are the 4 parts of a paper. The reason why I've drawn those fancy inverted triangle and the proper triangle there isn't just for aesthetics. It's to indicate that you're taking the introduction should be very broad. You're talking about the topic in a general manner, in a broad manner, and then you're narrowing it down as part of your introduction to say, okay, this is what's known in this field, but here's what I'm really thinking about targeting in this paper. Then you have the methods which are further narrowing things down and saying, okay, this is exactly what we're going to planning to measure. This is how we're going to do the study. And then you've got the results that tell us what's going on. And then the discussion again is that contextualization that I was talking about, where you're saying, okay, now that I've found these things, what does it mean, right? Not just in my classroom or my context or my institution, but what does this mean for someone else who's reading this paper, right? What is it telling us about things in general? And so that's why it's broadening out at the bottom again. So that's the intent of those two triangles there. So let's start with the abstract. Okay, I'll go through the different sections now over the next how much ever time I have. So the abstract should be an accurate summary of the paper, right? You can think of it as an advertisement or preview. As I said earlier, many databases are going to have your abstract available for free for people to read it, right? So it's your chance to tell the world, this is what is in my paper. And many a times then a subscription might be required, or you sometimes have to pay per article to read the actual paper. So it's an advertisement of your paper to the whole world, right? So that's why it should be accurate. You shouldn't be making false promises or false claims about what's in the article, right? Because someone might say, oh, wow, this is exactly what I need to read. And then they get your paper, it turns out to be something else. You don't want to be in that situation. So you want to have an accurate, honest sort of summarization of your paper in the abstract. And mainly, I would say, again, from that same perspective, it should help a reader decide whether your article is what they are looking for. Why is this important? So this is not in the slide in the bullets there, but one of the things that matter professionally as an academic is your citation count, right? How many people have read your paper? How many people have cited your work? Those kind of things matter when you're working at, prestigious research-focused institutions. That's what they are looking for. It's not just X number of papers published, but who's reading your work? How important are you in the field, right? Those are things that matter to like the top level schools. And so they're going to look at their faculty's citation index. And so having an abstract that's accurately pointing people to an article that they should be reading, right, is important, because if your abstract is not good enough, most people, or if it's not really depicting what's in the paper, they might have cited your paper because it's relevant to your work, but because that's not clear from the abstract, they're going to go pass on your paper and read something else, because everyone has limited time when they're reading papers for their literature review, right? So make sure that you spend the time to make sure your abstract is good. Last point I would say about the abstract, write it last. Quite often at a conference, your abstract is required earlier and then you have to write the paper. But even then, if you get a chance, and especially if it's a journal paper that you're writing, make sure that even if you've written an abstract at the beginning, once you are completely done with the paper, go read your own paper once, take some notes from your paper, and then rewrite your abstract without even looking at the first abstract that you wrote. It's very important that you should be looking back on your completed work and then writing your abstract, rather than thinking about, yeah, this is what I want to write in the paper, and that's why I'm going to write the abstract that way.
Okay, quick question. Should we start writing education research paper whenever we think of doing something new?
Yeah, I think if I understand the question correctly, my answer would be yes. You should start jotting down your ideas first off, and then do your literature review to figure out, is your idea or what you're trying to do, is it really new? Because a lot of times you might think that, oh, this is really new because you've never thought of that before, but you'll find 100 papers published on it. Now, when you do that, when you look at the 100 papers that have been published, you can then make a determination to see, am I going to add something to this body of knowledge by doing it here at my institution? Is there something different about what I'm doing that is going to add knowledge to this? Or is it not adding new knowledge, but still reconfirming things that are already known? That could be a useful paper too. So let's say someone's shown that teamwork done a certain way works in America, right? In a certain context at an American institution. And you want to say, well, let's see if that same idea applies to my institution in India. And you can describe like, why do you think there might be differences in what you're doing and so on. And then try to set up an experiment similar to perhaps what you've seen in the papers that you're reading, and then write your paper. So yeah. And the third possibility, I guess, is that you might look at it and say, well, I'm not really going to add anything new to this. So I'll do the innovative teaching, but I won't write a paper about it because it's not going to add anything to the body of knowledge. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Fine. Good.
Thank you. All right, so let's move on to the introduction. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each section, but some parts I want to spend some time on based on my experience with ICTI-EE as well as with JEET. There are some typical places where I see the authors are struggling and they're not doing as well as they should. And I'll say the introduction is one of those places. So I will be spending some time on the introduction section here. All right, so basically what's there is you want to start with a hook, right? Something that will catch someone's attention. When we write proposals for the National Science Foundation, we've been told in the training for writing proposals, your first line should be, this blah, blah, blah proposal is investigating XYZ in this context. Okay, so they want that first line to be very clearly indicating what is it that you're trying to do. Okay, same thing applies to papers as well. So you want to be very direct in starting off and saying, this is what our paper is going to do. Then you want to give that broader perspective on, okay, why are you doing this, right? Make the point of why this topic is important, broadly speaking, right? Not just the work that you're doing in that topic, but let's say collaborative learning, right? That's a very general topic. Why is it important to learn about collaborative learning or write about collaborative learning? You can have some broader context there, and then have some examples of successful collaborative learning and so on, some broad statistics perhaps, and then start narrowing it down to, okay, within collaborative learning, right, what is it that you are really investigating, right? So end with your research question or statement of purpose. And so the question naturally arises, what is a research question, right? So if you've not written papers before or are not familiar with the idea of a research question, here is an example. Okay, so there's a lot of text on the slide, so I'll go a little slow. But just to give context, this is one of my papers that actually won a Best Paper Award. I think it's one of those papers. And what we were studying there was that we had an in-person course where we developed some lab assignments and some projects which were, students were doing in teams, and we wanted to see how well does this translate to online. So this is pre-pandemic. This was, I think, 2017, 18, something like that, or 16. And I was at ASU then, and ASU has an online program in software engineering. So we were trying to see the materials developed for an in-person course, which were shown to work well in an in-person setting, do they translate well to an online setting? And so that's the question that we wrote down. That was our research question, the stuff that's in bold and italics. How well do activities and projects designed for in-person cooperative project-based learning translate to an online class? So you might notice we've given details in the research question, right? In-person cooperative project-based learning. So there's a lot of qualifiers there that tell us exactly. It's not a broad question. I mean, it's kind of broad, but it's at least saying this is the particular thing that we're going to look at, okay? And then the other thing I want you to notice is the wording here, which says how well do activities and projects, okay? So the how well do or how well does, that kind of wording is better than a binary question, right? Which is, does this work or not? Is it good or not, right? So the yes or no type of questions typically don't make for good research questions. And again, I'm generalizing here. There are certain yes or no questions that are very important to answer, but there are better ways to ask the question, and some putting in some nuance like that to say how well or what are the things, what are the characteristics, and so on. So massaging that question a little bit to be a little deeper, looking at more aspects of what you're trying to do rather than just saying, is this good or not, right? Can lead to much better research. And so when you're phrasing your research question, it's important to think about that. Now, besides the research question, there are typically what is known as variables. Okay, so there is usually a dependent variable, the thing that you're measuring. So for example, we might be measuring the students' grades for to keep things simple. I don't think we did that in this class. Maybe we did, or in this project. But let's say that's what we're doing. So the grades of the students is our dependent variable, right? And the independent variables are the manipulations that we're doing, right? So for example, we teach the course without project-based cooperative learning activities, and we look at what the grades were, and then we change that the independent variable, the thing that we're manipulating, to say, okay, now we're going to introduce these team-based, project-based activities in the class, and then we're going to again measure the grades of maybe a different set of students, right? Maybe you do this in this year, next year you try to do something else. Or you could divide the term into halves and say, in the first half, we're not going to do cooperative learning, in the second half, we're going to do it, and so on. And there's many variations of that, and I have a slide later on to talk about some of that. But those are the kind of things that you should be thinking about as early as the introduction section to very clearly tell the reader, this is what I'm going to do, this is my research question, this is how I'm going to find out what the conclusion is of that question, or what the answer is to that research question. Okay, so that includes typically a hypothesis and prediction. So in that text above, you can again see we're saying, from this we hope to inform the design and implementation of cooperative learning in other online software engineering and CS programs, right? Up top you can see the hypothesis is that teamwork and projects designed for an in-person course do not translate well to an online medium, right? So this is perhaps a little controversial. We're trying to say here, in fact, that what we are trying to do here is not going to work well, right? So you can phrase your hypothesis that way, or you could phrase it the opposite way as well. Either way is fine. You could say that, well, we think they are going to translate well, and this is how we're going to test whether they did or not. So the test is going to be the same either way you phrase the hypothesis. Any questions?
Let me just check. Not specifically about the research questions, so we'll get to those later on, one or two.
Okay, all right, yeah. Sounds good. Okay, so as I was saying, the introduction section could include your background or literature review, or it could be a separate section, doesn't matter. So we'll talk about that part now. Okay, so this is one of those places where I would say, based on my 6 years of working with JEET now, or 5 years working with JEET, this is the weakest section that I normally see in the papers that come in from India specifically, right? So let me spend some time on that. Again, generalization here. I'm sure there are some authors that do a very good job in this section as well, but for the most part, this is where the holes are. So, and one of the reasons for this usually being a problem, even before I get into my bullets, I will say, a lot of times what happens is people do something in the classroom, they gather some data, they write the paper, and when they're writing the paper, that's when they say, well, I haven't really cited any literature, let me go do a literature review at this point. Okay, I have done that myself, so it's not something that I would say, that only you guys do and I don't do that. I have done it myself on a number of papers, I would say, not just once or twice, and that's not a good thing. And it should be obvious why that's not a good thing, but I'll still say that it's because that literature should be driving your research. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It shouldn't be that now that you've done all the work, you need to cite 10 papers and you've only looked up one so far, so you need to look at 9 other papers and write about them in the literature review. Many people do that, and then the literature review section looks terrible because it's very clear, it's very obvious that this was post-fitted into the paper, and it really doesn't make sense. Okay, so try to avoid doing that as far as possible. Let's look at what's in the background and literature review section. So you want to tell the reader this context again, right? So in the introduction, you gave a more generalized thing about the area as such. Now in the literature review, you're becoming more narrow, more focused on the problem that you're looking at, right? The one thing that you're going to study, what is already known about that part, and why are you studying that, right? So it's also still motivational to say, okay, 40 people have looked at this particular aspect of it, but most people have not looked at this other aspect. And so you want to cite a few papers from the people who've done this work, and it's important work that they have done, talk about that, and then make the case for why you should be looking at this other thing that people have ignored or is yet undiscovered in some form, right? So for each of these, you want to provide important, essential, relevant summaries, okay, in your own words. Again, this is another thing that I struggle with when I'm reviewing papers for JEET. People just copy an abstract and paste it in their literature review. That's not what you want to do for a number of reasons. First off, it's plagiarism. It's not allowed, okay? Secondly, if you're just copying someone's abstract and putting it there, you're again not saying why this work is relevant to what you are trying to do. So you shouldn't be copying the whole thing. It should have a logical flow. You should go from, say, for example, in 1978, so-and-so studied this part. In 85, someone built on top of that, and they've narrowed it down further to say, this looked like an interesting thing. Then in 2001, someone did this. So that kind of logical flow, which is usually chronological, but could be a different flow, but has to have a flow. It shouldn't be 8, 9 random papers that you just thought would be a good fit, and you write a paragraph about each of those one after the other. Seen that numerous time in work that my PhD students and my master's students used to do. As I said, I have been guilty of doing this myself, but it's important to keep that in mind as to why you are doing this, okay? So a couple of more things here. Do not so make sure to use the correct citation formatting. And I'm not going to go into details of citation. There are different formats. There's APA, there's MLA, there's IEEE formats. There's many different formats. Make sure wherever you're submitting, you understand what is their format, expected format, and stick to that. And that includes both the in-text citation as well as end of the article citations that you have. Let's talk a little bit more about plagiarism. Okay, so do not copy directly from someone else's work. So maybe you've, as I said, don't copy and paste the abstract from that paper. Also, if they have a literature review section that's pretty good, don't be tempted to just copy paragraphs from their lit review section and put them in your lit review section. Okay, it's plagiarism, copying either word to word, or writing someone else's findings in your own words but not attributing. So kind of trying to make it look like these are your findings and not theirs is also, those are two common ways to plagiarize. One is either to just copy and paste something from someone else, and the other is to do this kind of more shady thing where you're trying to show you've done something that you haven't done, okay, that someone else has actually done. In some very rare cases, it is okay to quote something verbatim. Verbatim means like word by word. You copy a whole sentence or 2 or 3 sentences. When you do that, you should be putting it in quotation marks. There's a very specific way to copy a quote from some other paper or book or whatever. And it could be because you want to make a point that someone said exactly this thing, and maybe there is a particular reason why you want to give the exact quote, but it's usually not the case. It's very rare in an academic research paper that you want to directly quote from some other paper, okay? So most of the times you shouldn't be doing that. What you should be doing is, again, I'll continue talking about this section because I think this is where most of the problems are. You should be writing full summaries of 4 to 5 sentences, and as you're doing that, answer these following questions, right? What was the article's research question? Now we're talking about the ones you are citing in your literature review, right? What was their research question? What was their design? Like what were their variables, the manipulation, all of those things. What did they find out, right? What were their results? What are their implications? And most importantly, this is why you need to write it in your own words, is what does that mean in terms of what you are trying to do, right? No matter how hard you look and try to copy paste from somewhere else, they are never going to be telling you, right, why their work is important for your work. That has to come from you. And since you're trying to answer that particular question, this last bullet here, that's why the whole thing needs to be written in your own words, okay? So Last point here, always tie back to your current topic. Last slide on introduction. End with the rationale of the current study, right? Specifically, what are you attempting to contribute? Remind the reader of your larger research question. Explain how the research question or questions are related to the larger issues, right? You're tying back again. And then describe specific claim or hypothesis or question that you have. So now we've narrowed it down, and the reader now knows, but at this point, they should know exactly what to expect in the methods and results and discussion, right? So I'll pause, take a sip of water, and see if there's questions.
Okay, yeah, let me just quickly get you a couple of questions here. How to write literature review for a situation where not much research work has been done in the area of education research?
Yeah, so a lot of times there is work that we just haven't discovered yet. So there are, I've been doing this kind of research for more than a decade now, and at times it might feel like not much has been done in this particular area or this particular topic, but usually there is. So if you do a good literature review, you are very likely to find relevant papers. So I would say it's more of putting in more effort into doing the lit review, doing that search, rather than coming to this conclusion that nobody's done any work in this area. It's very
some journals have restricted pages that creates a problem for literature review.
Restricted pages as in you can't read the articles, or
I mean, some paper submissions. There are some journals or conference proceeding might ask just 4 or 5 pages for a paper.
Yeah,
there may not be enough place to put a good literature review.
Right. So it's a good question. I would say there is a balance that you need to strike, right? As I was saying earlier, why would someone want to read your paper? Are your results so important, and are you going to show them in a certain way? So I'll get to the results section soon, but you can show them as big pie charts that are taking up a lot of space, or you could write them up in a paragraph, right? So you have to judge as to how important are your findings and how much space they're going to take up in your paper, as opposed to making that connection of, okay, this is why I did this research, this is why these findings are important, right? That's a balance that you need to be a judge of.
Okay, some institutions don't have good library services, and hence literature survey is not good.
Yeah, and that's a very practical question. I agree with the person asking the question. It's something that you need to take to your leadership and say, these are some of the common databases that we need access to. It does cost a lot of money, but in the NIRF rankings, if you want papers from faculty that are going to be impactful, that are going to be cited by others, we need to read papers first. We need access to those papers. Yes, you have to fight with your management to get better access.
Okay, keep going.
There are other options. You can change institutions, you can pay for the paper yourself. But yeah, I think all of those are valid options to think about. All right, so let's keep going, and thanks for the questions. Keep it interactive. As I said, I have, I guess at this point, 7 more slides, but it's important that I answer your questions rather than cover all your materials. That's how I teach my class. That's how I want to do this as well. Okay. All right, so next section is the method section, right? And this is also a difficult section for people to write, especially if they don't have training in EER. So they're trying to just take whatever they learned in their technical area and then trying to do SOTL or EER kind of work. This section tends to be different from what you're typically used to, because usually there are human subjects involved, and so you have to write details of what is your participant pool, what are the materials that you used, it could be surveys, or maybe you're doing some video interviews, what were the prompts for the questions in the interviews, maybe you're doing a focus group, again, what were the prompts for the focus group. So that kind of details on the materials and how you did things. So in human subject studies, the how part is very important, and I'll give a very quick example of this. I was presenting a paper a few years ago at the Frontiers in Education, and I talked about we did this demographic survey, which is essentially asking people, things like, are you male or female? What is your age, if that's relevant? Other personal details about them that might be relevant to the study. And then we had a set of questions in our questionnaire that was giving us the information that we were looking for. And one of the audience members raised their hand and said, there's been research that shows that asking people demographic questions first and then asking them the questions from your survey skews your results. So people from a minority representation, for example, go on the defensive when they're asked about their demographics, and then they're asked about how do they feel about this course or something like that, right? As opposed to that, if you ask those survey questions first and then ask the demographic, that's a much better way of doing it. So that's that procedure part, right? What are you telling the candidates or the people that you're surveying or interviewing or doing your study on? All of those details of how the study was administered, all of that becomes very important when we're dealing with human beings. Okay, it's not the case in our technical research. I mean, the procedure is important in technical work as well, but it takes some more nuance when you're dealing with humans. Okay, so details. This is something that, again, I see quite often when I'm reviewing papers. The details are missing. There might be some indication that, yeah, my participants were from a second year mechanical engineering course, but they don't tell us like how many participants were there, how many were male students, how many were female students, and if it's important to your study, like how many were living at the hostel, how many were local students. Those kind of details that are all relevant to your study should be mentioned. So just think about when you're writing this section, have all of this kind of information, right? Your participant sample, how many, where do you get them? Did you exclude any participants, right? So that's an important one as well. So if you're trying to study something and on purpose you have reduced the pool to take out people that are not going to agree with what you're trying to prove, that's bad design, right? Sometimes it's necessary. There are certain cases where you might think that, well, I don't really want to interview these set of people here, and then you should explain why, right? So it isn't wrong to do it always, but it's very important that you explain what are the limitations, what are some of the factors involved in your selection of people, right? Self-selection usually happens, and that's not good. So you don't want to just say, oh, the students that volunteered for this study were the ones that I picked. Well, if you're trying to test a teaching innovation and you are only looking at the volunteers, typically those are going to be the students who are excited about that innovation, right? That's why they're taking the time to engage in your study. That's going to give you biased results. So if that's what you did, you should say that that's what you did. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. Sometimes that's the only way to do it. You don't really have any other way of doing something. You have to seek out volunteers, but just mention that this is how you sort the volunteers. This is the number of people. Say, let's say you have a class of 60 and then 15 students volunteered. You need to give those numbers and you need to tell how it is that you selected those 15 and not the other 45. So hopefully you get the picture that kind of detail is really necessary in these kind of papers. Okay. Similar details on materials, right? If you did a survey of the students, was this survey already published somewhere else? Was it something that has been shown in the literature to be a valid survey? There is something called validity of a survey, and the reliability of the survey. Has it been proven to be a good survey instrument, or did you come up with that survey yourself? If you came up with it yourself, then you need to talk about how did you go about that process, right? Did you just sit down one day and come up with 10 questions? And that's okay if you did, but you need to mention that that's what you did. So typically when I do this kind of work, and if I'm coming up with new questions, what I would do is I would then take those questions to other experts in the field and ask them, look, this is a study that I'm trying to do. These are the questions that I'm planning to ask my students. What do you think? How can we change this? And there's actually some process involved in that. It takes time, and you need to document that process as well to say, okay, this is how we came about these 10 questions, right? So once again, details matter a lot with all of this. Okay, I'll pause here to see if there's any questions on methods.
Question about survey type of papers. Typically, who would write survey or those type of papers?
Yeah, so this is somehow a question that I always get when I'm talking to an Indian audience. People want to write survey papers and they're asking about it. I think the survey papers are important if you feel the need for it, right? Again, once again, it's all about the reader. Do you think that people are not aware of the research in this area, right? If that's the case, and that's why you want to write a survey paper, I think it's a good enough reason for doing that. But you should be sure that that is the case to begin with, right? Just because you don't know much about this area doesn't mean everybody else doesn't know much about that area. So ask around, try to get a feel of what the, I mean, one way to look at it would be to see, are there publications in that area from your geographical region or whatever your target audience is for that paper. If people are already writing about that topic, clearly people know about that topic, right? There isn't a need for a survey paper. If you believe that there aren't a lot of papers on a particular topic coming from your area or your target audience, then it might be a good place or a good time to write a survey paper on that. Other questions?
How can a fresher be expected to be an expert in the field?
You're not expected to be an expert in the field if you're a fresher. And I was like that, right? When in 2007, I started working in this particular area. All of my background was in computer engineering. All of my publications, all of my research work was in computer engineering, nothing to do with teaching and learning and engineering education research, okay? I had a mentor at Oklahoma State. I knew someone who was also from a similar background. He was an electrical engineer who had transitioned into becoming a well-known researcher in engineering education research. I worked with him. I learned from him. I partnered with him, and slowly I built up my knowledge. I mean, my initial papers were pretty crappy, actually, and not good papers at all. But that's the case. I mean, you start somewhere and you get better at what you're doing, and eventually you start doing good work.
What is research design? How to do research design?
Oh, good question. I have a slide. The last slide in this particular section is on that. So it's just showing a couple of examples. One of them is a post-test only, right? So you have a subject pool and you divide it into two parts. There is an experimental group and then there is a control group. So the control group is where you're not doing the treatment that you're testing for. The experimental group is where you are doing the treatment. So that's why, and the idea is that you try to break these two up into as similar a subject pool as possible. So what are the similarities? Well, maybe there are 10 people here and 10 people here. In each of these groups, the number of male and female students, that ratio is the same or very similar. Whatever else the variables might be, you try to account for having as much similarity between these groups as possible. And for that, you can actually do some initial demographic testing to see statistically, is there a variation in the subject pool? And if there is, then you can rebuild the subject pool. So there's a lot of, again, details, a lot of things that can be and should be done in order to just get to this step. Now, once you're here, you can then do your measurement, right? Maybe you've done the treatment and now you're looking at the impact on grades, or you're looking at a particular assignment and looking at the quality of that assignment as measured by some criteria that you have described. So you measure both of these groups and see, are there statistical differences between what you found for the experimental group versus the control group. So that's one kind of a study that you can design, a very common kind, I would say. The other kind is something that I was kind of alluding to in that previous one as well. So you have a subject pool, but in this case, you're not just measuring at the end. You actually have some pre-test and post-test. And most of the work I have done has usually involved this second kind of design because our subject pools might not be big enough to get actual statistical significance on a lot of these things with just a post measure that we see on top. But if instead of that, if we have created, say, a questionnaire, a test, it has 25 questions, you ask the students to do that questionnaire, those 25 questions at the beginning, then you do the treatments for each of those groups, and then you do the post test. What is different about this second part as compared to the first part is that then you don't need the experimental group and control group to be as similar to each other as possible. So there could be some difference to begin with, and your pretest is going to tell you that, right? And then what you can do is you can see, you can measure the growth or the difference between the post-test results and the pretest results, right? So on an average, let us say this group scored a 3 out of 10 on the experimental group scored 3 out of 10 on the pretest. The control group scored a 4 out of 10 on the pretest. Then on the post-test, the experimental group scored a 7 out of 10, and the control group also scored a 7 out of 10. Well, if you just look at the post-test measure, both groups ended up scoring only 7 out of 10 at the end. But from the pretest, then you can tell that, well, the control group was actually better prepared for doing this because they had an average of 4 out of 10, whereas the experimental group had a 3 out of 10. So, that tells you a little bit more about the population and about your results when you do a pre and post test. Hopefully things are not as close as what I described. Hopefully you see the experimental group getting an 8 it went from a 3 to an 8, and this went from a 4 to just a 6 or 7 or something like that. If you see results like that, and again, I'm simplifying it a lot, there is a lot of nuance and all that to it. But when you run the statistics on all of this, you should be able to show that there is what's known as a statistically significant difference between the two groups as far as that post-test measure or the difference, the delta between those two is concerned.
Some papers are just based on circulating Google Forms and analyzing results. How important are such papers to the research community?
Yeah, they can be important depending on what is the question that they're asking. If there is a need that is identified very clearly, and that need is being met by the questionnaire that is that Google form, it still could be a useful paper. Not every paper needs to have an experimental design like what I'm saying here. This is just one or two examples here on the slide. Those could be useful papers. So my bottom line answer to all your questions typically is going to be, think about the readership. Is it going to be useful for someone to read this paper? Are they going to gain some knowledge from it, right? If you feel there is a need, if it's going to be useful, then yes, it's a good paper, right? Or a good topic, or a good way to do it.
Okay, you have any more slides, right? Or do you?
We're almost out of time.
Yeah,
I have a
great.
few slides. I'll go through them quickly.
Yeah,
right?
go ahead.
So, and to be honest, I wanted to focus on a few things, and I've already focused on them, so we're good. Results section is typically going to have a narrative description of what was measured, right? And then a statistical notation of what that looks like, and then visual representation as in a graph or something. So again, depending on how much space you have, you might want to put graphs or you might put tables. It's really up to you and how best your results are viewed. And again, I'll make a very quick comment here. I often see pie charts here in the results section, which shouldn't be pie charts at all. Okay, so beware, think about what kind of graph. Also, another very quick thing, if you've got independent things as what should be a column chart, I often see people do line charts on them. Line charts are to show a trend from one point to another, right? If you're showing three independent things, don't connect them with a line. Have individual columns. It should be a column chart. So all these things are important. How you're presenting, even graphically, how you're presenting your results is very important. All right, discussion section. The only thing I really want to say is that it's an important section, right? It's most important because here's where you're contextualizing your results. Why do your results matter, right? What is the impact locally? What is the impact in terms of research? And as I've said before, remember, you're writing for your reader, okay? A conclusion section can be part of this section or separate. And then I've got two more, this is my last slide. How do you become good at writing papers? By reading papers, right? Everyone wants to write a paper. Nobody wants to read a paper. So read papers, review papers, become a reviewer for ICTI, become a reviewer for JEET. It's very useful. You get to see again and again both good papers as well as mistakes that you should be avoiding. The more you read papers, the better you're going to get at writing. Last point here, do not think of paper as an end goal. A lot of times we think of this as, oh, I've got to write a paper and then you're done. No, it's not. It's just another point in a collection of points that make up that literature. Think again of that context, okay? Contextualize your finding. Why does it matter that you found X or Y or whatever else you found, okay? Very last point of the last slide, IUCEE has two separate courses on paper writing. One is a shorter one by Pratibha Nagabhushan, and then we have in specifically for engineering education research, we have a year-long course which typically runs for more than a year. It's 15 months, let us say, which takes you from the very beginning ideation to actually writing all the sections and then finally coming up with a draft of a paper. So if you're interested in more details, reach out to Krishna. He can tell you about these courses. I believe the description is on our website as well. And
Yep.
thank you for attending. That's it.
Great. So let me close by again re-emphasizing that the conference is on the way, and this is one of the main motivations for having Dr. Sohum Sohoni give us this talk. So I'm hoping that most of you will be thinking seriously about coming to the conference and listening to what people are saying and publishing in the conference. And think about it this way: even if you don't have the most perfect paper ready for January or ready for publishing in the middle by submitting by the middle of August, don't worry. Use it as an experience to start writing a paper, because what we're going to do this time is, if the paper is reasonably good in terms of having made progress, we will have a proceedings published. Okay, the best papers, of course, will have to go through a proper review and published in JEET, because JEET is a Scopus index paper, and therefore we cannot afford to have mediocre papers in there, otherwise we'll lose the Scopus indexing. Okay, but in order to get to the JEET level, you need to have a halfway make good progress, and that is a good way for you to publish something in the conference, which then can eventually end up in JEET later on. Okay, so use this as a stepping stone to your career in research and education. So it'd be great. And of course, you don't publish a paper, just come to the conference and listen to what other people are doing. And also, I will be trying to recruit you all to review JEET papers. So watch out for my emails asking you to review papers. And both Soham and I are co-chief editors on that one. So we'll appreciate your help in that area. Okay, closing comments from you, Soham, and we'll leave.
Thank you, Krishna, and thanks everyone for attending. Hope this was useful.
Yeah, great. We had almost 200 people here. So good. Okay, thank you. So,
already. Bye.
Yeah, bye.